Picture this. Your nation is about to make the biggest leap possible in the direction of weaponized nuclear potential. And right in the middle of that, something goes wrong. Something goes very wrong with the person who's supposed to be in charge. Conspiracy or fact? Let's dive straight into it. The story of Homi J. Bhabha. Now, Homi J. Bhabha was India's nuclear physicist extraordinaire. For lack of better terminology, he was the one and only who wanted to kickstart the entire campaign, who as far as went on to convince Jawaharlal Nehru once he assumed office to be the first ever spearheader for any and all things atomic research when it came to India. He also made sure that there was significant space research that India ventured into. Now, Homi J. Bhabha wasn't just someone who was completely engrossed into the realm of science. He was someone who did his own part, who has ginormous amount of potential. But yet, he decides to start working for the government of India. He starts to work towards greating India's potential as a sovereign nation. What happens next is kind of iffy. If you just go to look at the official reports that have been put out there, if you go to see the word of the media, there are many more questions than there are answers, but then there are times when these questions make you ask more questions, and if you are concerned about the right amount of knowledge, you turn over a few stones that remind you of a lot, that remind you of certain assassination attempts that nevertheless were very, very real and very, very prominent. Now, all of this is beyond the point if you don't understand where this story originates from. Homi J. Bhabha was someone who would be only in the UK in terms of his practice, in terms of his research. He would never be in India when it came to practicing what he had learnt. He was born in a wealthy family, and he decided that the thirst for knowledge that he had could be extinguished abroad. India did not have that potential as of now, but he had the knowledge. And when presented with the opportunity to bring said knowledge and expand upon it, he jumped upon it quickly. So the story goes something like this. Homi J. Bhabha was back in India for vacation from the UK when World War II broke out. Once World War II broke out, he decided to stay back. And before you knew it, he found himself in the middle of certain government ties, certain Congress leaders, certain agendas that India was lagging behind in. And this was a time wherein the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States was very, very hostile. The Cold War, if you would say, was up and running in full swing. Homi J. Bhabha convinced Jawaharlal Nehru to start a program of atomic research, which later he pressurized with the right amount of knowledge and the right amount of scientific consensus behind him to ask the government to then venture down into the realm of nuclear weaponry. Easier said than done. One person spearheaded the entire campaign. And here is where things got very interesting. Now, on January the 24th, 1966 marks a very, very essential day for the entire concept of atomic research as well as atomic development in India. Why? Because the president of the Atomic Research Agency, for lack of a better terminology, did not survive a plane crash. Was this an intentional plane crash that was deviated? A deviant plan that ensued? Or was it a natural incident with no one to blame? Conspiracy theories range from one way all the way to the other. Conspiracy theories range from acknowledging certain things to letting go of the others with abundant reserve. But one conspiracy theory that holds a lot of water is this. Number one. And this conspiracy theory I'm going to break down into a few parts to make it a little more comprehensible for you guys. Number one. The VOR system, also known as the radio navigation system on a plane, is the end all be all when it comes to navigation. The VOR system is supposed to help guide the pilots when visual visibility and visual understanding of their environment and terrain and their orientation isn't very well. The pilot of this aircraft was very well aware of the fact that the VOR was giving him immense trouble. But it's nothing that pilots can't guide through. It's nothing that pilots can't then overcome. As a matter of fact, he understood the risk he was taking when he took off. But was it the only thing that resulted in the crash? Was it the only thing that resulted in the death of one of India's brightest minds? Or is it too far-fetched to think that 117 other people could have been bait? The entire thing revolves around a few facts, which I'm going to point out to you guys right here. Now, research. That's the name of the game. And I have a certain things that I want to point out. And having them in front of me, I guess would make better sense rather than me going off the top of my head and leaving a few things out. So, number one, as I mentioned, the tampered VOR system. The VOR system was tampered with or conveniently malfunctioned. Questions. But pilots were experienced, international flights with multiple layovers. They know what they're doing. They're more than capable of handling what they're doing. Understandable. Number two. When the pilot did not see where he was in terms of orientation when he was near Mont Blanc, he reached out to air traffic control. And air traffic control gave him a certain instruction list to follow for him to safely descend from that altitude and make his way towards Geneva International Airport. Were those commands tampered with? Was he talking to air traffic control, or was the communication intercepted and false commands were given out? Who would have to benefit from an airliner crashing? Well, if you're considering the fact that that airliner had the head of India's atomic research program, there is one country out there who has been known on years on end to suppress other nations from achieving atomic energy, from achieving atomic weaponry. Which makes sense, of course. No one wants the world to go and turn into a orbiting ball of fire and rubble. Everyone understands mutually assured destruction, hence why World War III never broke out. But before that, the number of nations that had atomic power were a handful. And those demanded the fact that the rest of the world should not achieve said power. It would level the playing field. The United States and the CIA were at the epicenter of this conspiracy theory. Why? Well, here's why. Number one, the official story take says that it was pilot error because of which the airliner ultimately went down and crashed. Which is understandable because pilot error can be human error, can be just that. You can write anything off as human error and there'll be no way of confirming or denying it. Here is where things get really interesting. The place where the plane crash occurred is right on the border of France and Italy. And the Italians back in the day were on certain tensions with the French. And they were using F-140G Starlight fighters. Now, what is a Starlight fighter? Interesting question. It's supposed to be one of the most compact as well as one of the most fast, as well as a world record holder in terms of being stealthy as well as being able to gain altitude very, very fast. And infamous for not being used by the United States, even though it was developed by the United States by Lockheed Martin. It was used by other NATO nations way more than it was ever used by the United States. And a little research took me down to the path wherein Italy made the F-140G Starlight fighters their primary in terms of aviation defense. And they would use these fighters for surveillance on Mont Blanc to check on French military deployments. Starlight fighters would disengage their radars, go completely off the grid, fly super low in order to survey, and then would quickly gain altitude and get out back into Italian airspace. Could it be that one of these Starlight fighters was doing the same thing, surveilling, and then when it quickly gained altitude, it went straight into the airliner? Possible. Or could it be that the airliner was duped into believing that there was no starfighter there, was duped into believing that all skies were clear? We know that they were having issues with navigation to begin with. What was a defense airliner in terms of a jet doing in the same airspace as a blind aircraft? I'm very much sure that the Italian aviation had complete communications with this jet. Why am I insisting that there was a jet present there? Because amongst the wreckage that was found, amongst the wreckage that till date is being found, because of global warming, a lot is thawing out. A lot of evidence that was preserved for 50 odd years is recognizable today. Newspapers have been found. Human remains have been found. Diplomatic bags have been found. Gems have been found. All cargo of the Air India Flight 101 that was supposed to be crossing the French Alps, heading towards Geneva. The entire concept of doubt lies when amongst said wreckage you come across a panel, a metallic panel that's bent, completely bent, almost as if it was in a crash. 25 centimeters by 12 centimeters, not that big, but certain letters that are very, very prominent on said panel, and that panel had the words USAF written on it, which stands for the United States Air Force. Now, two things. The United States Air Force would never send out a jet with USAF written on it if it was not under USAF control. If they were outsourcing jets to NATO, I am pretty sure that they wouldn't still have branding of the United States Air Force on it. But certain components that jets are made of, certain exclusive components that the Air Force has patents over, those components, when built in factories individually, always have branding on them, even though the rest of the plane might be completely stripped of any and all tags. This certain component will still retain that said tag. The point of the matter is the USAF tag metallic bracket piece was found amongst other wreckage components. Where did that come from? I'm pretty sure that an Air India passenger liner would not have United States Air Force written on it. So if you go by conventional terms that the media had offered us, it just goes to show that according to the media, when an airliner crashes into a mountaintop, could not pull up in required time, was under the impression that it had cleared the mountain, started descending but realized that the peaks were still there, could not manage to pull back up and crashed. How then was a bracket found in that exact wreckage spot that indicated another aircraft being there? Conspiracy theories also dictate that there was a head-on collision with a jet fighter. Why would there be a head-on collision if there was a jet fighter present who has very, very high maneuverability? A jet fighter can dodge a significantly larger aircraft, even if it's in significantly close quarters. You would not expect the airliner to have such capabilities, but the jet, it more than certainly did. As upon research, I uncovered that the F-140G was used in many air shows, many formation flights, many procedures of avionic strategical movements, in terms of formation flights, in terms of dogfights. This was a jet that was built to be very maneuverable. So the concept of a head-on collision goes to bed right there. There was no head-on collision. But another thing that we realize when we do a little more research is the fact that the F-140G has a lower firing ejection seat. What does that mean exactly? Nowadays, in every picture that you see, or every video that you've ever seen of an aviation jet, pilot triggering his ejection seat while in midair, the canopy pops open and he's shot straight up into the air, clearing the jet. But with the 140G, it was a lower firing ejection seat. That means that the lower bay of the cockpit area would pop open and the seat would be shot downwards. A lot of failures happened, a lot of errors happened, a lot of maritime incidents have happened because of this feature, ultimately residing with the fact that they changed it to a 0G, 0 airspeed ejection seat, just like every other modern aviation jet today. But back in the day, and especially at a time like this, a downward firing seat by the right pilot could be the perfect projectile, could be the perfect way to get out of a fiery crash. Almost as if you're pointing a car in the right direction and jumping out the door. Had he pulled the ejection seat and it was an upward firing seat, odds of him being seen, odds of him being in the line of contact would have been significantly higher. But a lower firing seat reduces a lot in terms of risks that had to be taken in terms of using the aircraft itself as a projectile to take down the airliner. Where this theory furthermore gains its feet is this. After the aircraft crashed, the ORTF of France immediately sent out a salvage crew, immediately sent out a distress call, immediately sent out rescue operations, only to call them off about an hour later due to horrible weather conditions. And if I may quote, the ORTF official statement states that it was less than likely that anyone had survived that crash. Understandable? High altitude air crash at that speed makes sense. Here's where it doesn't make sense. The following days, journalists, independent enthusiasts, air crash investigators decided to go up and hike up to the site of the crash, only to bring down a lot of evidence which was promptly confiscated by the ORTF. All evidence was confiscated by the government authorities. And ORTF, for those of you who don't know, was a strictly controlled government broadcasting service. Television and radio both, but complete government control over what would be broadcasted and what wouldn't be. Interesting how all the evidence was just swiftly taken away. Evidence that people find till date is nearly nothing in comparison to what would have been possible to come across at the time of the accident, of course. Yet, the evidence that comes out today, even today, holds a lot of water that makes us question the authenticity of the media reports that were put out then. Finally, we would go to the theories of Roche. Now, Roche was one of these investigative journalists who was also a sports person who was also obsessed with aircrafts and aircraft crash investigations. He was a business tycoon, many other things. Not really a journalist per se, but someone who was obsessed with the fact that aircraft investigations were a thing. Someone who was obsessed with the fact that you could debunk certain things, you could figure out certain things, even after a plane had crashed, about what went wrong. Now, this entire theory about the United States being involved gained a lot of momentum when a supposed conversation came out in the year 2008 between the former CIA officer Robert Crowley and the journalist Gregory Douglas. He published a book called Conversations with the Crow, an amazing book that ventures into a lot of things. But there was a theory that suggested that the CIA might have downed the Air India flight in 1966 to take out Bhabha and to sabotage India's nuclear program. Going as far as to quote that the CIA officer refers to Bhabha with an alleged incident, saying that Bhabha, that one was dangerous. Believe me, he had an unfortunate accident. He was flying to Vienna to stir up some more trouble with the atomic plans when his Boeing 747 had a bomb go off in the cargo hold. This was an official statement. A bomb goes off in the cargo hold. Why was this theory not present anywhere else up until said interview came out? A bomb in the fuselage, a bomb in the cargo hold would be the easiest way to down a liner. But why wait all the way until the French Alps, 3 minutes or so away from the Geneva International Airport, in order to enter its official airspace and begin its descent to land? Why wait all that time if you had to use a bomb? You see, the CIA and CIA's operatives do like to muddy the waters in terms of what actually happened. Even if they admit to certain things that they've done, they would like to muddy the waters enough that no pinpointing blame can actually be drawn back to them or the organization. A bomb? Sure, the CIA has used them ample amount of times to run sabotage programs earlier. But something tells me that this air crash was more to using another jet as a projectile to make it less seamless, to make it less of an eyeball bringer in terms of international incident. You see, this airliner had multiple layovers in multiple countries. A bomb would have demanded a formal investigation that ranged throughout these countries to figure out where the bomb originated from. Was it in a package that was boarded? Was it in a luggage bag that was checked in by a passenger? So many questions, none of which were ever answered. Why? Because the official theory never demanded that there was a bomb involved. Sneaky, isn't it? More evidence continues to come out each day. The more we realize that there have been such cases in the past, the more we realize that the possibility of such cases in the future isn't so far-fetched. Bottom line, India faced a tremendous loss in terms of one of its greatest minds that day. The nuclear program was achieved, but delayed by years on end. Who knows what would have been the next step of Bhabha once he achieved what he set out to achieve with his atomic research program. Who knows where ISRO would have been today. had Bhabha got the opportunity to complete his research and implement it in the ways that he wanted to implement it. The bottom line is that this conspiracy theory might not be a conspiracy theory. It might be actual fact. It's going to be it for this one. I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care and peace.